It's my pleasure to welcome our speaker for this evening, Dr. Judith Giesberg. And Judith, something you might not be aware of, and perhaps our audience isn't either, it was 25 years ago in the month of April that we inaugurated the Regional History Colloquium as a venue to present scholars from this region working on topics that relate in one way or another to the region. Our first speaker 25 years ago was Kathleen Brown, who you may know. Kathy is at University of Pennsylvania. I think right now she may be in Cambridge on a fellowship. At least she was about a month ago. So let's begin the second 25 years of the Regional History Colloquium tonight. Dr. Giesberg is the Robert M. Birmingham Chair in the Humanities and Professor of History at Villanova University. Giesberg is the author of 5 books: Civil War Sisterhood, the United States Sanitary Commission and Women's Politics in Transition; Army at Home, Women and the Civil War in the Northern Home Front; Keystone State in Crisis, Pennsylvania in the Civil War; and is it Emily Davis's?
Yes.
Emily Davis's Civil War, The Diaries of a Free Black Woman in Philadelphia. Her latest book, Sex and the Civil War, Soldiers, Pornography, and the Making of Modern Morality, was published in 2017. She also directs the digital project Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery. This is a collecting, digitizing, and transcribing information from wanted ads taken out by former slaves looking for family members lost to the domestic slave trade. Today, she will speak to us on Civil War and Civil Rights in Philadelphia. Dr. Giesberg, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for being here on a rainy night like tonight. I'm very pleased to be spending it with you. I'm going to make sure that I get my slides ready. So just give me one moment to make that work. And I am hoping that somebody there will give me a thumbs up and tell me that you're actually seeing my slideshow. Are we good? Excellent. Thank you, Tom. There's always that moment when I have to catch my breath to make sure that what I've got up on the screen is what you're seeing as well. I'm very pleased to be here and to spend this evening with you. And today is a doubly special day. As Tom suggested, I did not know that we're in the second 25 years of Lancaster Historical Society's speaker series, and I'm honored to be here in that second 25 years. But today is also really an auspicious day in the history of civil rights in this country, with the confirmation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson just a few hours ago by the Supreme Court, which is really quite an extraordinary moment. And I'm pleased that in some ways, what I'll be talking to you about today intersects with this just in a small way. I'm happy that it does. And I must say at the beginning, I apologize. I woke up with what appears to be quite a doozy of a head cold. I hope my voice will hold out. And I'm sorry that I just wanted to assure you, don't usually sound like a frog, but you're getting a very special treat today in hearing my voice the way it is. So as Tom said, I would like to talk to you about the civil rights community that developed in and around Philadelphia, and their activities in the immediate post-Civil War era, which is something about which I have written before, and about something that I am keenly interested in. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about it today. Some of the people we'll hear about today, you have no doubt recognize their names. Hopefully I'll also tell you about a few people who you have not heard about. So that's my goal for today. So we start with Emily Davis, though. Oops, there we go. I think my slides are now advancing. There we go. I want to start with somebody who I have done a great deal of work on. Her name is Emily Davis. Emily Davis was a young free Black woman who lived in Philadelphia during the Civil War, was in her early 20s when the Civil War began. And lucky for us, she kept a diary throughout throughout the first 3 years of the Civil War. She might have kept more diaries than that, but we have not found them. These diaries, as you're seeing on your screen, are pocket-sized diaries. They are held at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and they give us a great account of what the war looked like through the eyes of a young Black woman living in Philadelphia at the time. And I think she's a great way for us to start off today, because she really captures the excitement in the city and takes us right into the middle of the civil rights movement as it was happening, as it was occurring. So in the summer of 1863, as you all know, as Robert E. Lee's army was coming into Philadelphia, everybody in Pennsylvania, as Robert E. Lee's army was coming into Pennsylvania, everybody throughout the state was following this with much anxiety and not knowing what was going to happen and where the armies would become engaged. And Davis was among them. She was safely in. She didn't know that, but she was in Philadelphia. She had a family outside of Harrisburg, and so she was very concerned about the progress of the war. So she writes in her diary a lot about her family and her concerns for them. But she's also in the midst of this civil rights community in Philadelphia, where a lot of young Black men who she knows and who she goes to school with and goes to church with are volunteering to fight to protect the state of Pennsylvania. So Black men in Philadelphia that she knows are eager to get into the U.S. Army so they can defend the state from Robert E. Lee. So she talks about that in her diary, in entries that you can see up here on your screen. She says, I saw a company of colored recruits that looked quite warlike. She says in June. And then a couple days later in June, she talked about how exciting it was to see these young men with whom she went to school getting in a train and heading to Harrisburg as they were volunteering to fight in the army. And then, of course, these men were premature in their desire to volunteer. And when they got to Harrisburg, the state was not yet allowing Black recruits. So she heard that they were back, which she was, were coming back. So she was sort of mixed in with the excitement. She was relieved that they were not yet in harm's way. But what the diary really allows us to see is the excitement, the anticipation that the free Black community of Philadelphia felt in the midst of the war. Davis's diary really exudes that excitement and the anticipation that they would be part of it. Right, since the year before, really 1862, when with the passage of the Militia Act, Lincoln had authorized the recruitment of Black soldiers. Black men in Philadelphia had been drilling, they had been waiting, and they'd been looking anywhere they could to see if they could enlist. And of course, some men from Philadelphia wind up enlisting in some of the most prominent regiments during the war, like Massachusetts 54th and others like that. But their anticipation and their eagerness to get into it wasn't necessarily shared by other Philadelphians. The mayor of Philadelphia had first opposed, Alexander Henry had first opposed Black enlistment, belatedly was convinced that Robert E. Lee was a greater threat to Philadelphia than what he anticipated would be an angry white backlash to Black men enlisting. Overall, Pennsylvania began accepting Black enlistees later that summer in 1863. Of course, Black men knew, and you can see that in some of Emily Davis's diary, that this was just going to be the beginning of this, that once Black men got into the army, that would open up the door for citizenship. But again, this is not going to change anybody's minds. It's not necessarily going to change everybody's minds in the city of Philadelphia. White diarist, a sort of local curmudgeon from old Philadelphia money, Sidney George Fisher, wrote in his diary around the same time as Emily Davis what he anticipated was, the likely and undesirable outcome of Black men enlisting. When he said the abolitionists are trying to make what they can out of the enlistment of Negro soldiers and are likely to cause a reaction and injure their own cause and the real interest of the Negro. The orators claim equality for the Negro race, the right of suffrage, etc. And all of this is as absurd as it is dangerous. Fisher expressed the interests, the sentiments of Democrats who made opposition to civil rights for Black Americans the center of their political agenda. Black activists, on the other hand, allied themselves with the Republican Party. And when the war came, embraced it as really opening up a window to realize their civil rights aspirations, really pretty much the same thing as Fisher most desperately wanted to warn people about and to avoid, or what he was complaining about in his diary. What I'm talking to you today about is the period after, what I'd like to use that as sort of a window into talking to you today about the period after the US Civil War. It's usually referred to in sort of our history books as the period of Reconstruction, but it's also often referred to as the first civil rights movement, and different historians date that civil rights movement with different beginning and end dates. It's, and when we think about Reconstruction, we usually think about it being something that, that major activities occurred in the South and in the vanquished South, but it was also something that occurred throughout the northern states as well. And it occurred here in the state of Pennsylvania. And the civil rights community, of which Emily Davis and some of the people who I'm going to be talking about tonight were all part of, they were all part of this movement. This is a period, of course, when the Constitution was rewritten with amendments, written outlawing slavery, of course, declaring all Americans equal in their guarantees and protections of citizenship. That's the 13th and then the 14th Amendment. Well, nearly all Americans, women were not written into the 14th Amendment. And then to all Americans, the protections of citizenships. American historians have long struggled to explain sort of how this, or to sort of take this moment and think about how it occurs in northern communities like the one in Philadelphia. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how I understand this period as occurring in the city of Philadelphia. Of course, Philadelphia was always a vital center for Black activism, really from its very earliest years, where people in the city of Philadelphia were, there were critics of slavery who lived in the city of Philadelphia, and where some of the first very ambitious efforts to abolish slavery emerged. Philadelphia's community, free Black community, was operated at the center of this civil rights community that was active in the city from its earliest days. For instance, Philadelphia's Black activists really early on in the 19th century were very vocal critics of the American Colonization Society, which was in itself an early abolitionist organization. But Black activists pointed out rightly that American colonization, or the American Colonization Society in and of itself would undermine attempts to eradicate slavery, that this sort of idea of removing free Blacks would actually strengthen the institution of slavery. And people, Black activists and Black spokespeople in Philadelphia made that point very loudly, very early on, that the American Colonization Society was not a friend of abolition, that in fact it would undermine the aspirations of abolitionism. And they also pointed out, these activists in Philadelphia, that the American Colonization Society worked against their goals for achieving Black equality in the North as well. The work of these early spokespeople for Black civil rights in the city of Philadelphia centered around some of the city's strong Black institutions, such as Mother Bethel, African Methodist Episcopal Church, which you see here in this slide, an early sketching of from around 1830. The activists who met, for instance, places like Mother Bethel were crucial in pushing white abolitionists toward immediate abolition. People most prominently, perhaps one of the most prominent examples of that is people like William Lloyd Garrison, who was impressed by the arguments they made opposed to colonization to move toward immediate abolition. So for decades, Black activists in Philadelphia had spoken out against slavery and against also, halfway abolitionism that was expressed through the American Colonization Society. But by 1840 or so, as we got closer to 1840, abolitionism in the city of Philadelphia became more and more controversial, and abolitionists became more susceptible to attack. And there were many more sort of violent confrontations between those people who spoke out against slavery and those who were advocates for preserving the institution. So Black abolitionists in particular, but also white abolitionists, were often attacked, and brawls broke out between advocates for and against slavery. Probably most prominently, the example that all of you are all already thinking about, one of the most stunning examples of this violent attack against abolitionism occurred in May of 1838. When at a meeting of the recently constructed Pennsylvania Hall, where abolitionists from around the country were meeting, including Garrison, of course, and Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Lucretia Mott, and others were gathered. White Philadelphians raised alarms about what was happening at the meeting, because there were both white and Black abolitionists meeting in the hall and screaming or yelling or raising the alarm that what we had here was race mixing, or the term that they used in the 19th century, amalgamation. They called a mob to the hall, and the hall was burned down. As you can see here in this period sketch of the burning of Pennsylvania Hall. It's really striking to sort of think about this moment recently as I was writing down my notes for tonight, to think about how this fear has been echoed recently in calls, in very recent calls that people are making to reconsider the 1967 Loving versus Virginia decision by the Supreme Court. This sort of call for fears of race mixing. I think we're seeing some of that appear in political language again. The Pennsylvania Hall burning was one of only many examples. Other attacks followed after that. Some Black churches in the city of Philadelphia began to hunker down and to rescind invitations to people like Frederick Douglass to come and speak in the city, because they were concerned about rising acts of violence. So sometimes, in response to some of this, a lot of activism within the city went underground. Activists didn't disappear, but some of the work became sort of less commonly known and reported on, and we certainly know that about some of the underground activities of people like William Still, who's a wealthy coal merchant, lived in Philadelphia, who becomes a leader in the Underground Railroad. And of course, you all know that William Still, pictured here in this slide, famously kept a record of all of those he helped through his Vigilance Committee, which was an effort, his effort to, as part of a group of committee members to help protect people running away from slavery, fugitive slaves. So Still's activities were sort of in this continuum of civil rights organization that we're going to be civil rights activism that we'll be talking about in just a moment, that really takes off during the post-war era. Still was not only involved in Underground Railroad activism, but he also was one of the early protesters of segregated streetcar travel in the city of Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia was serviced by several streetcar companies, all of which were segregated. Some of the lines didn't allow Black riders at all. Some of them ran separate cars just for Black riders, and some would allow Black riders, but only if they stood on the front of the streetcars next to the conductor, behind where the horses were tethered to the streetcar. And Still, early on began to protest segregated streetcar travel. So this campaign that I'll be telling you about begins really before the war, with protests like William Still's, and is actually challenged in the courts of Philadelphia, where the court upholds the streetcar segregation. So it began sort of quietly and inauspiciously before the war, when the right of segregation was confirmed in a court case. But it doesn't go away, right? The campaign is really just beginning there, and it will take off in the post-war era. In one part of in one way of sort of looking at the civil rights community that emerges in Philadelphia is to look at this streetcar campaign. So not having had a whole lot of luck before the war in contesting segregated streetcar travel, during the war, the campaign to integrate streetcar travel will begin to turn more attention toward it, and will begin to have more success when Black men do begin enlisting in the United States colored troops, and will begin to be seen in and around Philadelphia, traveling in streetcars in their uniforms, and will also be confronted with the humiliation of being denied service on these streetcars. So this campaign gets a very early boost because Philadelphia is such a powerhouse place for the recruitment of Black troops, and there are so many Black men who are trained in and around Philadelphia and muster in through Camp William Penn. This campaign will eventually become the focus, or two different groups will be part of the campaign to integrate streetcar travel in Philadelphia. One will be led by William Still, who you just saw on a previous slide, who through his participation in the Social, Civil, and Statistical Association will campaign for integrated streetcar travel. And then, of course, on the right-hand side of your screen, the campaign will also be the focus of the attention of Octavius Catto, who you all know, who was part of the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League. Historians have sometimes overemphasized the differences between these two organizations, and there are crucial differences between these two civil rights organizations. But on this topic, on the topic of integrated streetcar travel, these two organizations work pretty closely together. Still, his approach was to appeal directly to the streetcar companies, to encourage them to drop their segregated streetcar travel. And he does this on behalf of what he refers to as sort of the respectable elite Blacks of the city. and and telling the companies that they have nothing to fear by allowing these respectable Black people in their streetcars. And Cato's Equal Rights League more directly works to lobby lawmakers in Harrisburg to be, to pass legislation that will eventually outlaw streetcar segregation. As I suggested to you, these two different approaches did not preclude these two organizations and these two men from working very closely together on this very issue. And the issue's not new, right? It's been around for quite some time, and there's been some public conversation about it. But when the war takes place, and when there are more Black men who appear on these streetcars, the conversation begins to accelerate. And in the post-war era, the campaign to integrate streetcar travel gets a boost because of these two organizations working in consult with one another. And then, right, the sort of moment of opportunity is opened in 1867 when state lawmakers ratify the 14th Amendment. This was, in no small part, thanks to lobbying work such as that Cato and others are doing through the Equal Rights League. But as the state lawmakers sit down to ratify this extraordinary amendment, those who have been eagerly looking for an opportunity to integrate streetcar travel see this as their, as the moment that they've been waiting for. Because it made sense, right? Here is the wording of the 14th Amendment, right? That all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state, the 14th Amendment says, shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. The first really full-throated expression of equality occurs with the passage of the 14th Amendment. And so the sort of import of that occasion was not lost on Pennsylvania lawmakers, nor was it lost on those who'd been pushing for civil rights in the city for decades. And so these Equal Rights League lobbyists are smart and very savvy, and they see this as the opportunity to bring forward a vote on a bill that had been proposed to the State House to outlaw streetcar to begin to desegregate the streetcars. And right, also sort of on not only is this a moment to sort of think about the 14th Amendment, but politicians in the state of Pennsylvania are also sort of gently reminded that in a day not too soon in the future, not too far in the future, Black men will once again be voting in the state of Pennsylvania. So this is also sort of a way to make this point a little bit more obvious. So with this moment presented to them, Cato is working through the Equal Rights League to lobby state congressmen, in particular, State Senator Morrow B. Lowry, who's pictured here on the left with the fabulous frock of hair. I'm almost struck by that. And of course, Cato, you all know what he looks like there on the right. Right, they're working together to bring this law to the State House floor. And Lowry is a state senator from Erie, Pennsylvania. He introduces the law to the Pennsylvania State House that he proposes will to outlaw streetcar segregation. And he does it with quite a flourish, telling people, sort of reminding, those there present that, of what's been happening in the streets of Philadelphia, that Black riders have been ejected from the streetcars and denied streetcar access. He says, Philadelphia stands disgraced before the world for her conduct in attempting to block up the highway of the colored man in his great and unequal contest in the battles of life. And with that, he makes his case very, convincingly. And the streetcar bill is signed into law in March, on March 23rd, 1867. So this is the first sort of moment at which you can mark the success of this civil rights community, in some of their post-war efforts, really to begin to change the way life is lived among Philadelphians of color in the post-war era. This is a notable moment. And so, right, in order to mark that moment, the people who were central to this campaign plan a meeting to celebrate the passage of the bill a couple of days later. And speakers meet and audience members, attendees meet at Liberty Hall, which is located on 7th and Lombard Street in Philadelphia. It was actually the original location of the Institute for Colored Youth, the premier Black school for Philadelphians, and really another really important locus point for the civil rights community in Philadelphia. So it's an auspicious place to meet. They meet there. And speakers there single out the work of people like William Forton, who is not pictured here, David Bowser, who's there on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and Cato are some of the people who speakers in particular sort of note and recognize for the work that they did to integrate streetcar travel in the city of Philadelphia. So during in the evening at this meeting, people make speeches and thank the men for what they've done to integrate the streetcars. Speeches like this is quoted from "Gentlemen, the undersigned feel it due to you to make this statement, setting forth the services you have rendered your race. The bill is essentially your own, having been drawn by your chairman, Mr. Forton." This meeting, right, like I said, which was held there at the former home, or the first home for the Institute for Colored Youth, was well attended, and all who were present noted sort of how happy it was to be there to celebrate this milestone in a civil rights campaign. And this was an appropriate location. As I suggested to you a moment ago, the Institute actually had relocated by then. It was now at that point located at now 9th and Bainbridge. But this was a crucial center for Black activism. Here's the newer building at the time, the Bainbridge location. The men who spoke there that day, who the city celebrated for their civil rights activism, had also been educated in the rooms of the Institute for Colored Youth, where they'd learned, Latin, Greek, algebra, philosophy. They also honed their activism. And they had learned all of these things alongside of women who were also educated at the Institute for Colored Youth. This is a photograph that was taken that we think was accredited to the Institute for Colored Youth at a later time, not at the time that we're talking about now. But both women and men attended this school. And we have spent a lot of time recently thinking about the men who were part of the civil rights community. I really want to spend the time that I have remaining today telling you about some of the women who attended school with these men and whose names were not read that night at this meeting to note the advance of civil rights in the city, and who were also not invited to speak. And I want to start with Carolyn LeCount. And yes, my slide does say this is not Carolyn LeCount. We actually don't have a confirmed picture of Carolyn LeCount. So I'm using sort of a stock image of a Black school teacher, because that's what Carolyn LeCount, that's who Carolyn LeCount was, among other things. 2 days earlier, before this big celebration for celebrating streetcar integration, LeCount and other women had also met and greeted the news that, welcomed the news that lawmakers had passed this streetcar bill. In fact, they had been very much a part of this campaign from its very beginning. Although, we have learned less about. I have researched their role, and other people have as well, but we hear less about it. They also knew, though, although they celebrated the law, they knew that the law was only as good as the change that it could make in their daily lives. In fact, they had been waging this battle to integrate the streetcars during the war. And they had begun, in particular, because the women had organized organizations like the Ladies Union Association during the Civil War, where they were gathering supplies and food and other things that they were attempting to deliver to the US colored troops who were stationed in and around the city. And as women were trying to get to these Black men, they often wound up riding in these segregated streetcars. Openly actually defying segregation orders in order to bring to the soldiers food and medical supplies that they needed. This work had been dangerous. Women who rode those streetcars were regularly plucked off the cars, were wrenched out of their seats, and evicted or even thrown from the cars. But they continued to ride the streetcars. And when they did get evicted, they sued for damages. And sometimes they won. And all of this helped to focus the city's attention on the problems that segregated travel were causing for all riders, for Black riders, for white riders who complained about having to watch the violence or to witness the violence. And so this campaign unfolded in the streets of Philadelphia alongside of, at the same time, as Cato and Still were doing their lobbying work. The experience of getting evicted from streetcars was something that was widely shared among a lot of women of color. Harriet Tubman famously was taken from a train that was in Philadelphia when she rode through Philadelphia, was injured when she was taken out of a train. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper herself was evicted from train car travel. So this was an experience that a lot of Black women shared. And so when, people like Carolyn LeCount and others began to openly defy these orders and to sue the companies, they really were sort of part of a much larger movement that, their experience spoke to a lot of women and attracted the attention, and the movement grew from their experiences outward. In fact, in Philadelphia, women there watched keenly as campaigns unfolded in places like Cincinnati, where Sarah Fawcett, pictured here, a well-known hairstylist, was part of a campaign to integrate streetcar travel in the city of Cincinnati. Here's a picture of Mamie Pleasant, who was part of a streetcar campaign in San Francisco. And so these women, fed off one another. This campaign to confront segregation in the streets went from Philadelphia to other cities. And so when they heard, when Carolyn LeCount and her compatriots heard that this new law had passed, we can forgive them their skepticism that the law would stick unless they had sort of put it to the test, which is what they decided they needed to do, that this law had to be tested. And so they searched around for a good candidate to test the law, and their attention settled on Carolyn LeCount, who had been part of this campaign from the beginning, and who's also well known as a great public speaker and an established figure in the civil rights community. She was 21 years old when the law passed. She had graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth at the top of her class. And afterwards, she went on to become one of the first Black women to pass the city's examination for teachers. She would soon be the principal of the Ohio Street School, which is pictured here. And so she was a natural choice. As Black men were preparing to celebrate the streetcar integration bill, Carolyn LeCount set out with her friend to board one of the streetcars and to test the seaworthiness, if you will, of this bill. They walked to the corner of 11th and Lombard Street, just a couple of blocks from where LeCount lived. They hailed a cab, and when the conductor refused to stop, and the car moved on, LeCount called on the conductor once again to stop. The conductor once again refused to stop. And what he didn't know, right, is that what he had done, or rather he didn't know that it was Carolyn LeCount that he was doing it to. Carolyn LeCount promptly filed a complaint with the Philadelphia judge against the conductor and his company for breaking the law by not allowing her to ride. The judge, of course, is not going to make it easier for her. The judge claimed not to know anything about this new law. And, if there's one thing we, know about teachers in our lives who we all know and love, they're always prepared. And Carolyn LeCount was no different. She showed the judge a picture of, a newspaper article that, oops, I just got the wrong way. Yeah, I did. She showed, produced for the skeptical judge, a newspaper article that had announced the passage of the law. And he still remained unconvinced. In fact, in order for him to hear her case, LeCount actually had to go and get a certified copy of the law, which of course she did, because once again, #teachers. We can just imagine her, right, at that moment, sort of thinking to herself, here we go again. Of course, she was prepared. So later that night, when Philadelphia's Black community celebrated the passage of the law at this former home of the Institute for Colored Youth, LeCount listened to these young men give their speeches, but she also knew that she was part of that effort as well. And we can imagine her and the network of women who were likely also at that meeting, smiling and applauding, and also knowing that they had been part of the law being passed. And in fact, a couple of days after that meeting, Carolyn LeCount appeared in court. She told her story. She, evoked the words of the 14th Amendment about equal citizenship. And the conductor was promptly found guilty and fined, and the company was put on notice that streetcar segregation was indeed against the law. And right, and newspapers throughout the state published the news of the case. And put streetcar companies on notice that this was no longer legal. Imagine if the story had been told as widely as Cato's story. How would it have inspired others in their efforts to protect the right to ride? Imagine if Rosa Parks had heard it. I like to try to imagine what it would have been like if we would tell the story as much as we told the story about Cato. The years that followed Philadelphia's streetcar battle remained full of promise for the Black community in the city and beyond. People who graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth in particular found themselves in all sorts of spaces advocating for civil rights. The Institute itself hired some of its own graduates to teach there. Octavius Cato, Martha Farbeau, for instance, taught at the Institute for Colored Youth. Other people who graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth became famous first. People like Dr. Rebecca Cole, one of the first Black women to become a doctor, graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth in 1863 too, alongside of Carolyn LeCount. Institute students would go on again, after sort of graduating from this School of Civil Rights, to have distinguished careers teaching in places beyond Philadelphia. Here's a couple of examples, a few examples. Sally Daffin, who taught freedmen in the South, and also Cordelia Atwell, who opened the Ohio Street School, where Carolyn LeCount also taught. And then, of course, James Smallwood, who taught Black students in a Black school in York, Pennsylvania. All of them were graduates from the Institute for Colored Youth, and all of them took their lessons about civil rights really into the post-war era and advocated on behalf of freed people and Black Pennsylvanians wherever they were. A couple more slides that tell us a little bit more about them. Jacob C. White is another graduate from the Institute for Colored Youth who went on to do great things for civil rights. And of course, Cato, who all of you know quite a bit about. So, these post-war years were full of a lot of promise. The 15th Amendment, of course, was ratified early in 1870, and Black men in Pennsylvania were able to vote for the first time since 1838. And you all know, of course, where that story winds up as well. There's quite a lot of tension in the streets of Philadelphia when that first interracial election is set to be held in 1870. And so federal troops are called into the streets of Philadelphia to make sure that things don't get violent. But there are no federal troops in the city of Philadelphia monitoring the elections in 1871 when fights broke out. And on election day in October of 1871. And it's, of course, on that election that 3 Black men are killed in Philadelphia. One of them was Cato, who was gunned down on 9th and South Street, hit by several bullets before he died. Black Philadelphians turned out for Cato's funeral, of course, in great numbers. They laid him to rest in his U.S. Army uniform, and it was quite a moment. And it was quite a shocking moment for civil rights activists to have lost this young man when really they began to see the fruits of their campaign. This is usually where the story ends, but I want to just take a few minutes to point out that the story really doesn't end here at all, because we sort of, the last time we sort of hear from Carolyn LeCount is usually we sort of see, she's sort of pictured beside Cato's grave, grieving the loss of her fiance. Of course, they were engaged to be married. And of course, this was an incredibly sad moment for her personally as well. She was cut down by this terrible loss. But she also was quite young at that moment, and she lived to be 75 years old. And for the rest of her life, she continued to work for civil rights in the city of Philadelphia and to bridge the gaps between this generation of civil rights activism, really almost until the next generation of civil rights activists who would grace the streets of Philadelphia. And I'll just tell you a little bit more about what she does after she, is no longer sort of, when Cato is no longer alive after Cato's death. LeCount will continue to advocate for all of the same sorts of equal protections that she and her generation had done for years. They will have several different opportunities to speak on behalf of Black teachers, or she will have several opportunities to speak on behalf of Black teachers. She will advocate before the Philadelphia School Board for Black teachers. We'll point out that Black teachers had to get a higher score on their exams in order to be qualified to teach than white teachers. She will advocate for Black teachers to be posted in Black schools to teach Black students. And she lives a very long life advocating for Black education. And she also takes opportunities such as the one opened up with the planning of the centennial in 1876 to remind white Philadelphians of her generation's work on behalf of civil rights. When the centennial was being planned in 1876, white organizers like Elizabeth Duane Gillespie come to Carolyn LeCount, and Rebecca Cole we still don't have pictures of either of these two women to show you. But Gillespie approaches these women and asks them to be part of the organizing committee, asks them if they will help her to raise money for the centennial exhibit, but then also warns them that they're only allowed to sort of, they're supposed to be helping her fundraise, but they're only allowed to fundraise in the Black neighborhoods because they won't be welcome in the white neighborhoods. And this is a shocking offense to Cole and LeCount. LeCount refuses to accept the terms as Gillespie presents them. So she declines Gillespie's offer and says it publicly in a newspaper account in which she says, I think not. She asks in response to a question she's asked. In fact, I feel certain that we will take no part in this commission whatsoever. So this is just one small example of the ways in which Carolyn LeCount will continue to advocate on behalf of civil rights in the community for the rest of her life, as will others with whom she worked those early years of civil rights campaigning. We've done a lot of good work lately in the city to acknowledge Caddo and the work of his generation and what they did to advance civil rights in Philadelphia after the Civil War. Here's a picture of the new headstone that was added to his grave in Lebanon Cemetery. And of course, he now has a gorgeous statue at City Hall. But we don't have yet anything marking the life of Carolyn LeCount and some of the other women with whom she worked in this first generation of civil rights activism. And it reminds me, of current civil rights efforts underway and the really, really important organizational work of Black women in organizations such as Black Lives Matter. Here you're seeing a picture of Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, who are all co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And really, are very much sort of our generation's versions of people like LeCount and Cole and others who are operating in these spaces. And then, of course, Tarana Burke, who's also the founder of Me Too. In conclusion, I would just say, I started with this, George Fisher sort of predicting the worst, right? That what would happen during the war is that, that once Black men started to operate in military uniforms, they would push, and the next thing would happen was that they would get the right to vote, and other things would occur, right? That Fisher thought were quite awful. But of course that is it in fact had happened, right? There was much progress that had been done during the war, but it had also been done because women were there as well, and not just there as well, but also operating in their own spaces, advocating for the same rights. And so we close with Emily Davis once again, whose diary I think captures the sentiment of the moment well, when she says, in this, on the day that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, but I think it can account for a lot of the days during the war, when she said this today had been a memorable day, and she had thanked God that she was there, had been spared to see it. So thank you all for listening to me, and I'm very sorry again that my voice was not up to par. The last slide that I have here for you is some other places that you can turn for some of the information I used on this presentation, a few books and a couple of articles that you might go to if you're interested in following up on anything that I talked about today. So thank you, and I'm going to stop now, and I'm happy to listen to your questions or answer your questions.
Great. Thank you, Judith. That was fascinating and packed with so much information. We've got some great questions here, and we only have a few minutes to get to some of them. Right off the top, how unusual is it that you've got an African-American diarist in this period. Any sense as to how usual or uncommon that is? And I'm going to ask you to answer briefly so we can get to some more questions.
Sure. It's very unusual. It's not, I mean, she's not the only one. There's certainly other diarists. They're just numerically speaking, Black women diarists are in the minority.
So the whole streetcar ordinances, and any sense of how often people of color defied these ordinances around streetcars? Was it rare? Was it commonplace? Do we have any grasp of that?
The newspapers reported on a lot of these incidences. I don't have a sense of, the entire scope of the activities, nor do we have evidence of, of there being a coordinated effort. We don't have sort of a smoking gun that people sort of sat down and figured out how to do this. But there are enough of these names appear enough time, more than once to suggest at least some coordination, if not willingness to try different lines and different ways around it. So the short answer is we don't know how, we don't know the numbers, but notices or accounts of these kinds of evictions were pretty regularly published in the newspapers throughout the war.
And one would have to imagine that there, if you think about the Black churches on a Sunday, right after one of these events, they're going to be the talk of the day. So it's not too hard to imagine kind of almost orchestrated, organized efforts to keep testing and pushing. I love the fact that you had the picture of Rosa Parks on the bus. Very late in her life, I had this remarkable honor to meet her. And I normally think of desegregation as a 20th century phenomenon, but here we're talking about desegregation really, well, early on from one vantage point in 1867. I guess I just wonder, how can that experience of desegregation in Philadelphia on the streetcars be parallel with other communities? I know you mentioned Ohio as one example. Was this happening in other places in the North? Was it happening anywhere in the South?
Yes, and yes, it was happening in, as I suggested, there was a similar campaign in San Francisco that unfolded, and in Cincinnati there was a pretty dramatic couple of confrontations in New York. One with a widow of a deceased U.S. colored troops soldier that galvanized the attention of New Yorkers. There was also, I think, similar campaigns, maybe as far south as maybe Louisville. There were some examples. There were southern cities as well, where this became an issue. It's not entirely clear how much we can sort of compare the organization there, but there were episodes like striking episodes that got people's attention and got people talking about.
Okay, so I think we're all fairly familiar that early in the 19th century, you have Quakers who are fully engaged with abolitionist activity in the Philadelphia area. Once we move into the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and even to the 60s, are they still as participants in this whole, in the instance of desegregation of the streetcars or other activities?
Absolutely. There's a story told of actually Lucretia Mott aboard one of these streetcars in the midst of one of these episodes, and I don't remember the exact details, but either standing with somebody or sort of refusing to allow herself to be implicated in the segregation. Yes, absolutely. There are still, people like Lucretia Mott are still very much a part of this effort, as are other Quakers. So that is a straight line through.
Okay.
Antebellum period to the postbellum period.
So I'm thinking, on the one hand, you have 1838 and the burning of Pennsylvania Hall right after the passage of the new Constitution.
Yep.
For the first time, well, Black men are denied the right to vote. And then 1871, you have Caddo in this kind of other sort of bookend. Do you think there is a connection between all that led up to the passage of the new Constitution in 38,
Yeah.
that denied Black votes, and what happened in Pennsylvania Hall during that convention? Had it been organized as kind of a smackdown on the part of the white community to say, we're going to stop this now?
I think that's a great, I have never thought of that question. I've never sort of considered the possibility of that, right? Like you, I've always read about that episode as sort of, in the language at which the sort of mob spoke of it, which was that they were offended by the promiscuity of, the mixing of their races, and it was burned just a couple of days after it had been sort of opened. But it's got to be, there has to be something to your hypothesis that sort of tension after, and the anger that with which the new Constitution was received by both Blacks and whites, and what this meant for going forward had to have, tensions had to have been running high.
Yeah, so there's something for your next project. Here this new Constitution and this newly dedicated building. Yes. And then it's gone and burned to the ground. Right. I wish we had more time. I think we have to wrap it up here, but I really want to thank you for starting us on this next 25-year passage into the Regional History Colloquium, celebrating that anniversary that I mentioned at the beginning. You've given us a lot to think about, Judy, and we thank you for your work and encourage you to keep digging. There are a whole host of questions we'd love to ask that have to do with Thaddeus Stevens and our local situation here, Lydia Hamilton Smith, but those can wait for another day. So again, I want to thank you so much for this great presentation tonight. I also want to thank everyone who has attended. We are delighted to have your participation. As Emily mentioned earlier, please look for a recording of tonight's lecture on our YouTube channel. After leaving the Zoom, you'll get a pop-up questionnaire asking you to kind of weigh in about tonight's program and give us your suggestions about future programs. You can also register for the next iteration of the Regional History Colloquium, Ghost River from Colonial Past to Native Present. Again, thank you, Dr. Giesberg.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for attending tonight, and we wish you a wonderful evening. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.